So for this video, I want to talk a little bit about race and ethnicity, just a broad overview before we get into some of the more specifics. Um, so when we think about contemporary aspects of race and ethnicity in the United States, there are two features that you should keep in mind. And again, some of this stuff we're going to get further into and we'll kind of unpack and dive into a little bit. But two things that you should keep always in the front of your mind as you're thinking about issues related to race and ethnicity in the United States. The first is that conflict, discrimination, inequality between racial and ethnic groups still remain pretty deeply entrenched in the United States. It is also true in other multi-ethnic and other multiracial societies, but obviously our focus is going to be on the United States. The short version of that is that race is still a pressing issue in American society, and I think most everybody is aware of that, but it's good to kind of keep that front and center in your attention. This is true, and it's true in spite of declines in open discrimination. It is true in spite of the passage of major pieces of civil rights legislation over the years. It's true in spite of improving conditions for some racial and ethnic groups. It's true in spite of the election of Barack Obama. All of those things are arguably steps in the right direction, but I think we can all agree that in spite of the fact that we've been moving in the right direction, there are still problems in the United States related to race and ethnicity, especially intergroup relations in this country. Things are better, but there's still a long way to go. Number two, the second thing you should keep in mind is that intergroup relations, so the relations that exist between racial and ethnic groups, are becoming increasingly complicated. They involve more groups and a wider variety of dynamics. For example, and this is just one of many different examples, the number of Latinos in the United States has grown dramatically. Immigration trends have shifted around. Populations have moved around internally, and the United States is poised to become what we call a majority-minority country sometime in the next 15 years. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but certainly by mid-century, the United States will be what we call a majority-minority country, which to me sort of underscores the problem of using the terms majority and minority. But what that means, of course, is that the majority of the population of the United States will be made up of minority group members. Right now, whites are still more than 50% of the total population, but just barely. And as I said, for not very much longer. That doesn't necessarily suggest that power relations are going to change, right? Just because a group is in the numeric majority doesn't mean it is the dominant group. You can look at apartheid-era South Africa and see a very nice refutation of that idea, right? That at the height of apartheid, there were 25 million blacks in South Africa and 5 million whites, but whites were very much the dominant group. So just because we're going to see whites become less than half the total population doesn't necessarily mean they are going to wield any less power than they have now. In fact, even after that transition occurs, whites will still be the largest group. It just won't be more than half the population. Now, by the end of the 21st century, and this is a little bit far off, right? That's 78 years from now, so a lot of things can happen. But if trends continue in the direction they're continuing, the majority group in the largest group of people in the United States will be of Latin American descent. But again, it's hard to make predictions that far out because so many things can happen over the course of 7, almost 8 decades. So, we tend to be a little bit guarded about long-term predictions. So relative population size can be a factor in stratification, right, in the structure of inequality. But again, it doesn't have to be. in the case of the United States, obviously, we're going to have to wait and see. All right, so let's talk about our concepts. I've mentioned race and I've mentioned ethnicity, so let's talk a little bit about each of those. A race is a socially defined group of people. Both of these are social constructs. Let me just take a step back and say that right off the bat, as almost everything in society is. And we can talk more about that if you have any questions about how race is a social construct. Certainly, we can get into that in class or in the discussion threads or wherever you'd like to have these conversations. But race is a socially defined group of people who are generally regarded to be physically distinct in some way from others, and who are regarded by others or by themselves as a distinct group. And so when you look at that definition, you'll see that there are kind of two components that are working there. The first is a social component, which is the sense of group identity, right? The shared group identity that people in a racial category share, or the shared construct and understanding of the racial category that a group who is kind of constructed that category understands it to be, or sometimes both, right? But there's a social dimension which is organized around the group identity. Then there is the physical component, which is organized around the markers that we use to categorize people and organize them into racial categories, right? So what are the criteria that we use to organize people into racial categories in the United States? Well, as you probably know, the primary driver of that is skin color, right? And skin color is a function of melanin, right? Melanin is something that exists in your skin cells that make your skin dark. More melanin, darker skin; less melanin, lighter skin. The reason for darker skin or lighter skin, where we find particular populations of people who have darker or lighter skin, is entirely related to exposure to ultraviolet radiation. It's an adaptation to environmental conditions that operates through the processes of natural selection, or at least historically, as we evolved as a species. So darker skin is more resistant to ultraviolet radiation. So if you live in a region of the world, say, in the equatorial regions of the world, or extreme northern latitudes or southern latitudes, where you have long periods of exposure to the sun and thus long periods of exposure to ultraviolet radiation, your skin becomes a liability if it's light, because you're going to absorb more ultraviolet radiation. You're more likely to develop cancers. If you develop cancers, you're more likely to die before you can reproduce. Natural selection is going to select for darker skin. Darker skin is just a natural protection against increased exposure to ultraviolet radiation. But as we move north or south from those equatorial regions of the planet, we find there's a little bit of a dilemma. Darker skin becomes a liability in those environments because while it is sometimes harmful, sunlight also provides very, very useful benefits. Ultraviolet radiation, for example, helps stimulate the production of vitamin D, which is very, very important for healthy organisms. So if you have skin that is too dark, you're going to be less likely to generate sufficient amounts of vitamin D because you're not getting enough exposure to sunlight. And so lighter skin is going to be more evolutionarily advantageous in those environments. So it's literally just skin deep, those differences. The amount of melanin in your skin has no implications for your work ethic. It has no implications for your intelligence or your propensity for any kind of cultural patterns or behaviors. It's literally just, are you protected against the sun where you're getting exposed to a lot of it? And are you able to absorb sufficient amounts of ultraviolet radiation in areas where you're getting less exposure to the sun? Right? That's really all that reflects. But nevertheless, what we've done is we've taken those physical markers, skin color, hair color and texture, the shape of a person's eyes, the color of their eyes, all of that. We've taken that, we've used that to create these racial categories, and then we organize people into those categories, and we attach consequences to being in one category or another, which is what makes these social constructs real. The problem is, of course, that because they're social constructs, they're very, very, well, I shouldn't say they're very difficult, they're impossible to falsify. There is no black gene, there is no white gene, there is no Asian gene, right? So there's these criteria that we use to organize people into racial categories have genetic elements, but they're separately heritable, right? The gene that controls the expression of melanin in your skin cells is different than the gene that controls the color of your eyes. And the gene that controls the color of your eyes is different than the gene that controls the bone structures of your face, or the genes in that case that control the bone structures of your face. So there isn't a marker that we can look at on the human genome and says this person is black, this person is white, this person is Asian, this person is, right? We don't have that, and because we can't falsify a racial classification, it's not a scientific concept, and even biologists don't really talk about race, right? It's not a useful scientific concept. It is still very much real, but it's real because we make it real. So when we talk about race as a social construct, we're not saying that it doesn't have consequences. We're saying that as a set of categories, that's kind of arbitrary. So because of its problematic nature, a lot of people would want to find something maybe a little bit more reliable, something with a little bit more validity at the very least, and that brings us to ethnicity. Now, ethnicity is also a social construct, so kind of keep that in mind. But an ethnic group is a group of people who are generally regarded by themselves or others as a distinct group, so kind of like race. But the recognition here is based on shared social or cultural characteristics rather than physical characteristics. So social or cultural characteristics could include things like nationality or language or religion, food palette, right? So it could be a lot of different things, but the distinction here is going to be one of culture rather than physical difference. Again, just as socially constructed as the other as race, but no less valid, right? That maybe even more valid because ethnicity probably more accurately reflects how people see themselves than race. A significant number of times, a person of very, very dark skin of African descent, but who grew up, eighth generation in the Dominican Republic, might see themselves as Latino and not black, at least not black in the sense that we understand that in the United States, right? So both of these things are useful. We want to keep, again, like most of the sociological tools you're developing or you're sharpening this semester, you want to kind of keep all of those things in your toolkit, but just kind of understand what they are, what their limitations and strengths are, and by all means, of course, where they come from and how they work. That's going to be very, very important. So, before I wrap this up, I want to take a couple of minutes. I'm going to try to make it just a couple of minutes. And I want to talk about where our particular construction of race, and by our, I mean in the United States of America, where this particular construction of race comes from. Because every society, or almost every society, will go to some length to divide up its population by racial or ethnic categories, sometimes both. But each society does it somewhat differently. There isn't because these things aren't fixed kind of empirical qualities of human organisms, but rather social constructs that are created based on characteristics that organisms have. you're going to find a lot of variation in where racial categories come from and how they work and what they mean. So in in the United States, and actually to understand this history, we have to go back to a little bit before the founding of the country, to when we were the British American colonies. Um, the current understanding of race, right, that we have today, arguably has its origins in the late 1600s, around 1677, 1678, 1679 is where this kind of begins to happen. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen in a very quick set of successions, but rather it gets constructed over a couple of generations at the very end of the 1600s and the very beginning of the 1700s. So to take you back to that point in time and to give you a sense of how this happens, the first thing you have to understand is that the original slaves in the North American colonies, the British North American colonies, were white. We don't call them slaves today, we call them indentured servants. And this points to a problem that we have with slavery, which is that there are lots of different kinds of slavery. And when we say slavery in the United States, most people think of blacks, people of African descent, people being kidnapped from the western coast of Africa and being brought to the Caribbean and to the United States, or again to the British American colonies, bought and sold as property, right? So all of those kinds of images of slaves that for us really start to show up in the 1700s. That wasn't the case for all bonded labor. Bonded labor just means that your labor power is kind of, it's owned by somebody else for a period of time. So if you're a chattel slave, which is the kind of slavery most Americans think of, I think, when they think of slavery, in chattel slavery, your labor is bonded for life. You're a slave when you're born, you're going to be a slave when you die, right? That's the system that most people are probably thinking of when they think of slavery. But there were slaves that existed in the American colonies before that who were slaves for 7 years or who were slaves for 10 years, after which, if they were still alive, they were set free, right? So slaves, but only slaves for a period of time. In other societies, slaves became slaves because one society conquered another society militarily. In some places, people became slaves because their family owed a debt to some other family. So there are lots of different ways in which your labor could become bonded in a condition that we would, maybe argue constitutes slavery. But it's important that we not think of slavery as this kind of monolithic thing. All right, so the original slaves in the British American colonies are white. They are indentured servants. They're working to pay off their debt to the person who holds the bond on their labor, because the economic activities that are being engaged in the British colonies, agriculture, mostly extractive economic activities like agriculture and food production, these are very, very labor intensive, right? There's not a lot of technology at the time that makes, planting and harvesting cotton particularly easy to do. It requires a lot of workers, or tobacco, or rice, or indigo, or woad, or whatever you're producing, tobacco, right? It takes a lot of workers. The easiest way to make your economic venture profitable is, of course, not pay your labor. So if you can find a way to have labor that you don't have to pay for, or that you pay very little for, that's going to mean that your economic venture is much more profitable. And that's really what these colonies are. They're not founded by people, with some exceptions. These colonies are not founded by people trying to get away from British society. They're founded by people trying to make some money. And you make some money by going and producing something that can't be grown back in England, like cotton or tobacco. So you come over to North America, you're an indentured servant, you get to the end of your period of servitude, and you're free. And you're free now to go do whatever you want, become a farmer, go try to work as a tradesman in one of the cities in these colonies. But but it is still, for the period of time, the 7 years or the 10 years that you're an indentured servant, you are, in all senses, you're a slave. Your labor does not belong to you. You do whatever the bondholder tells you needs to be done. So the first African bonded laborers arrive in North America in Virginia colony in 1619. Right, so 24 bonded laborers, 24 indentured servants of African descent arrive in Jamestown. They are put to work like every other indentured servant, and at the end of their period of indentured servitude, they are set free, because that is what you do. You do your labor, you do your time, and then you're set free. People of the early 1600s are not stupid. They know that these people don't come from England. They know that these people don't come from Europe. But the thing that really matters in terms of the identity that these other people have, and where they fit into colonial society, isn't a function of their skin color. It's a function of the condition of their labor, right? Are you free or are you bonded labor? That's really what it comes down to. So there is racial diversity, but no one's really thinking about race. Certainly not in the way that we think about race today. That understanding of race is going to come about a century later. So what's happening, though, is that as labor supplies of indentured servants begin to dwindle, chattel slavery is going to become more popular, and there are lots of things that lead us to this particular moment. So one of the things that's happening a lot in the 1600s are uprisings, right? Indentured servants are increasingly resisting the conditions of their labor, their servitude. It's not pleasant, even if you know at some point, right, you might live long enough to enjoy being a free person. It's not easy, and especially for the indentured servants of European descent, like the English who have been brought over, or the Scots-Irish who have been brought over. Right, these are people who are poorly suited to the climate of, say, for example, the Carolinas or Georgia or Virginia, where it can get very hot and humid in the summer, and there are diseases that they don't have any kind of natural immunities for. And African labor is a little bit more attractive to the people running these plantations, because African labor is more suited to those particular kinds of working conditions. So there's as the pool of available white indentured servants begins to shrink, the desire to sort of have them replaced with African labor is sort of right there, sort of waiting in the wings. One of these uprisings that seems to have kickstarted a lot of dramatic change with regard to how the American colonists and the colonial governments thought about race was an event called Bacon's Rebellion, which happened in 1676. And in this rebellion, Nathaniel Bacon, who is a landowner, wanted to expand westward, but westward expansion in Virginia meant encroaching on lands that belonged to Native Americans, and the Native Americans and the British government had settled treaties that said we would not expand into your territory, and Bacon wanted to force the government of Virginia colony to sort of abrogate those treaties and let them go and settle lands further out to the west. And of course, the British government said no, and Bacon said, well, fine, we're just going to try to overthrow the local government then. So he put together a rebellion. It failed. They did manage to burn the city of Richmond, but at the end of the day, Bacon himself died of dysentery during the months that they were planning these uprisings, this rebellion. But the other organizers of the rebellion, of course, were hanged. They were punished, and the rebellion was put down. But it made people very nervous. And when I say people, I mean the British government and the economic venturers who were, sort of putting together these these plantations, these colonial holdings in which they were generating a lot of revenue for themselves and for the crown, and this rebellion really frightened them because it was comprised not just of Nathaniel Bacon, but indentured servants, some of whom were white, some of whom were black, um, free poor farmers who, certainly saw that they could benefit in some way if the territory of Virginia colony were expanded, and that included, of course, white uh, farmers and black farmers, because once an indentured servant was set free, they could become a farmer. It didn't really matter what color you were. So, so the planter class and their allies in the British colonial government saw a growing coalition of people who realized that they had some shared economic interests. And there were more of them than there are plantation owners and government officials. And that makes everybody very, very nervous. And so the idea here is that we've got to find a way to split this growing power base. This is a group of people who are developing what Marx would call class consciousness. They are aware that their economic fortunes rise and fall based on the class position they occupy within this society. And so the easiest way to shatter a power base is to split it in half. And the easiest way to split this power base in half was to turn white people against black people. But to do that, of course, you have to now create these categories, and you have to create not just the categories, but the meaning of these categories, right? So the white plantation owners say to their white indentured servants and to the poor white farmers that they want to make common cause with, they say, look, they don't say it quite like this, right? But they're not going to acknowledge that everybody is equal and the same, because they're aristocracy. They still want to be at the top of the social hierarchy of white people, but they also want all of the white people to kind of fall in line and be on their side. And so what they do is they engage in what Michelle Alexander calls a racial bribe. They say, look, you are not necessarily on the same level as me, but you're certainly better than all these other people. And the thing that makes you better than all these other people and makes you more like me is that we're all white. We share this kind of common heritage. We're descendants of civilized people, and we had to take these people out of the jungle. And when we brought them over here, they weren't even Christian and they didn't speak English. Right? They're savages. And you start to see a lot of that kind of dehumanizing language, because what they are going to do to their black indentured servants is make them slaves for the entirety of their lives. You're going to be born into slavery. You can be bought and sold as property. If you have children, your children can be taken from you and sold to other plantation owners. You can be beaten, you can be whipped, you can be killed without fear of punishment or reprisal, because again, the colonies needed an inexpensive labor pool in order to maintain economic profitability. And the easiest way to do that is to just create a class of people whose very nature determines that they are going to be in this sort of caste system. It's the development of a racial caste system. And so your white indentured servants become the overseers who get to exercise authority over these other former indentured servants, now chattel slaves. And that all happens in the space of about 30 years, right? By 1705, Virginia is passing a series of slave codes. Various colonies are institutionalizing chattel slavery. They're making it illegal for people who own slaves to set them free, right? These are private property. Presumably, if something is my private property, I ought to be able to dispose of it as I will. If I want to set my slaves free, then I should be allowed to do that. And the reason, of course, I can't be allowed to do that is because if there are a bunch of black people running around who are free, it's going to be hard to differentiate the slaves from the free people. So if you have a really easy way to tell the difference between people who are free and people who are slaves, it's going to make for a much more easily organized society. And of course, the criteria that determines whether one is free or whether one is a slave is skin color. And so this is where our racial categories begin. Now, of course, once those categories get created, they become reinforced by law, they become reinforced by practice and policy, they become integrated into the culture. The dehumanizing of chattel slaves based on race is essential, because if these people are human beings and they can be bought and sold, and you're also a human being, then at some point you also could be bought and sold. So one of the first things you have to do is make a clear um, um, ideological and belief system of ideologies and beliefs in which these people over here deserve their condition and these people over here deserve their station in life, right? And it becomes what we call essentialized. It becomes built into how we understand these people as entities, not as categories, but as people who share a criteria. In this case, skin color. So if you look at the total period of time in which there has been this kind of stark divide, um, and let's say we start the clock at 1619, when the first black African labor arrives in the British American colonies. That's 343 years, right? So you got 1619 to 1789, right? That's the period of shifting from indentured servitude to chattel slavery, and then the founding of the country and the ratification of our Constitution in 1789. Then 1790 to 1895, 1865, that's another 85 years. That's the period between the founding of the country and ratifying its Constitution, and then the Civil War. There's a brief period from 1865 to 1877 in which former slaves are no longer slaves. They're made full citizens. We call it Reconstruction. It's a period after the Civil War that's a relatively good, albeit relatively brief period for slaves and their descendants. And then from 1877 until 1965, what we call the Jim Crow era, that's another 88 years. So if you add up all of that time, you've got slaves, racially determined slaves in the United States for about 343 years. That's longer than America has been a country, right? So when I said at the very beginning of this lecture that racial inequality and tension and discrimination is all still very much there in American society, it's because that is essentially a significant portion of how this country was founded, right? How this country became so prosperous that it was able to declare its independence from the British Empire, which was the strongest empire in the world, even stronger than the Spanish Empire at that point, right? In the late 1700s. So the British American colonies declare their independence. They fight a war against the British Empire and they win, right? The reason they're able to afford the men and the materials and the weapons and all of that is that they have money, and they have money because the cost of producing all of the raw materials, cotton and wheat and tobacco and all of that, is being done with slave labor, right? Which means you're incredibly profitable, which means you have money. So slavery made the founding of the United States possible, and that I don't think. I mean, some people I think would probably, with all the about critical race theory that's going on, I think some people would probably find a way to try to object to that, but it's just objectively, historically true that the material prosperity of the United States at its founding was very much a function of the fact that significant segments of American economic productivity was done without paying labor costs. And of course, it was all being done on stolen land, right? So stolen land and stolen labor, in a weird sort of way, could be the forward history of the United States, or at least the founding of the United States. So race has been with us for a very, very long time, even though it's a relatively modern idea. And of course, the ideologies that justify racial oppressions, most especially things like white supremacy, have been with us for that entire period of time. And you don't have a society that's organized around that for such a long period of time without having it percolate into the structures and institutions of your society. And so when we talk about the way in which these things are deeply entrenched, that's very much what we're getting at. And when we come back later on in the module and we talk more about racial inequality and racial stratification, we're going to come back to that notion of structural inequality, because even as we reduce the amount of individual discrimination and individual levels of bigotry and racism and racist ideology, we still have inequality that is sort of organized into the structures of the society itself that kind of become self-perpetuating. And they're really, really hard to root out. But again, that'll be a conversation for a subsequent video. So until then, have a good one.